Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of Lua Tutorials, and in this one we'll take a deeper look into functions and see how we can use them in order to kind of simplify our code and without having to repeat the same things over and over again. So how does a function look like? Well, a function starts with saying function, and that's just a keyword like any other keyword like if statements, whiles, fors, etc. Then we give it a name, so let's just give it a name add numbers, and what this function will do is take the numbers, two numbers, and it's gonna add them together, and for that it needs two parameters. So these parameters are variables that we can use inside our function, and this is what we're actually sending to the function as something that we want it to do things on. So in this case what we'll want to do is return the addition or the sum of these two variables, and we're going to return the value of the sum. So if you send in like 3 and 4, we're gonna return the value of 7. So these variables can be, again, anything you want to name them. It's entirely up to you, and they are created when you start the function. So they only exist inside the scope of the function. And that's maybe a bit too advanced for now, but just let's see how we can use this function in order to kind of add our numbers together. So what we can do, because we return a value, we can save the returned value in something like a sum, and we would say add numbers of 5 and 11. And if we print out sum, what would end up happening, of course, is we would get the result of this addition. And of course, here we don't have to write numbers. We can also send in variables that have number values, and that would also give us the same result. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, why is this useful? Why do we have to add numbers? Why do we need functions? Well, that was just a very simple example to just kind of demonstrate how these things work. But one thing you can do you remember, like, we had the arrays, and there's no useful ways to kind of print out arrays, and maybe we want a function that prints out arrays out for us. And so how would we go about doing that? So we would say function again, we would name it something like print array so we know what it stands for, and what we would do is send an array in as a parameter. And at this point we can pretend, because we know that we are sending an array in as a parameter, that this is an array. So what we can do with this array is, of course, write a simple for loop that goes from 1 to the length of the array. So this is an alternative way, which I showed in one example, but I didn't explain it too much in detail. But you can also get the length of an array by saying hashtag and then, of course, your variable name. This also works for strings, by the way. And what we would do is we would IO write array of I, and let's just put commas at the end. And at the end, let's just put another new line. So what would happen now if we wanted to use this function? Well, let's say that we have two arrays, array 1, and let's give it some values like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's have array 2, and let's give it some maybe string values like A and B, and sure, why not C? So let's say that we wanted to write this out, so maybe we want to print the values in these arrays. So we could do that by, of course, writing our for loops and just going like this. Hashtag array of 1, do IO write, yeah, but you know, we would have to do this twice, right? We would have to do it once for array 1, and then we would have to do it again for array 2. But why would we do that when we can use just this print array function? So what we would do is just call our print array function, and we would input in an array of 1. And remember, this function doesn't actually return anything, so we don't have to save it in a variable. So this means that some functions, like the previous one, add numbers, can return certain values if you want, but in this case, just because this function just prints an array, it doesn't have to return anything. So for that reason, we don't need to kind of save it anywhere. And if you just say this, what you can imagine would happen, we send this array 1, so this exact array, into this function, and a new local variable is created called array, and this array is the parameter that we sent in from our main program. So in this case, this exact array. So what ends up happening is, of course, the array of this of the length of this array is 5, and it would just write. We would expect it to write out this array, and that's exactly what happens. And the great benefit of this is that not only does it work for array 1, but because it's kind of a basic formula, it also works for array 2 or any other array. So you can see how this can be useful. And maybe a print array function is not something that a lot of people think about, but it's, I think, one of the most rudimentary functions you can use in order to kind of see how your code is going along. So maybe if you want to debug something, you will just have this code somewhere in your functions, and then you would call it whenever you want to see what is going on in your arrays. Okay, so what are some other uses of functions? Well, I just showed you some functions that use parameters and arguments and things like that, but let me just give you another type of a function that you can actually write in Lua, and let's just call this function average. So what we could do is we could just end up putting 3 parameters in, for example, n1, n2, and n3, and we would set 3 numbers in, and maybe we could compute the average of these 3 numbers. But what happens maybe if you want to compute an average of multiple numbers? Maybe you want, maybe 2 numbers, or maybe like 100 numbers. Well, for that reason, Lua has something that we like to call dynamic arrays or parameters. So if you put 3 dots in, that means that you can set as many number of arguments as you want, and then you can access those arguments. So before, of course, we had variables in which we had our values stored when we send them to the function, but in this case, all the arguments get saved in a variable, so to say, called arg. And what we would want to do here, so okay, let's just create our average function. Let's just imagine how we would create our average function. So we would have a sum variable, which would, of course, kind of add all numbers together. And what we would do is also kind of create our variable, which would tell us how many arguments we have. And we can do that by saying this. So arg is the array which holds all of our parameters, and of course it's like any other array. It's indexed from 1 to however many parameters we have, and we can access those parameters by simply saying arg of 1 is our first argument or our first parameter that we sent in, and arg of 2 is our second parameter or the second argument we sent, and so on. And it'll be a bit more clear when I actually use this function for something. But if you want to kind of output these things, we can of course iterate through it with a for loop. Maybe we'll use something like this just to kind of reinforce what we already learned, and we would add up all the numbers together. So argument, so sum plus value, and what we would end up doing is returning the sum divided by num. So num is the number of arguments, and what we do here is iterate through all the values in our argument list, so all the parameters we sent in, and we return the value of, so basically the average, so sum divided by how many parameters we sent into the function. And if you just use this to kind of print out 2 numbers like 3 and 5, what ends up happening in this particular function is that a new variable is created called arg, and arg of 1 holds the value of 3 and arg of 2 holds the value of 5. And if we iterate it with this loop, we iterate through both values of this argument. So I mean both these parameters. So you might be wondering, is there a difference to actually just creating your own array and just creating a function which takes an array and then calculates the average? There's no real reason to doing that, because that's exactly what ends up happening. But maybe this is just a bit neater for some reason, and it's just a possibility that you can use to kind of have multiple arrays. So of course what we could do is also send numbers like this in, and we would have to worry about our length like if we actually had parameters inside. So you can see that the average of this is 16.1667. So like I said, there's no actual difference to just creating an array and sending that into a function that takes an array as its parameter, or just having 3 dots and just listing them like this. It's actually exactly the same. The only difference is maybe that this looks a bit neater in some situations, or maybe this is something that you would prefer to use. But I'm just stating it that it's a possibility to use this, and that's how you use it. Okay, so we looked at some basic examples that we can kind of approach from multiple directions, but because functions are a bit maybe complicated to kind of understand at the start, I would like to propose you with a few more things and tricks you can do in Lua. So let's just have this function, and I won't type it out because it's a bit too long to just type, but I will explain what it does exactly. So what this function does is it takes an array parameter. So at this point, like I said, this parameter name can be anything. You can name it even salad if you want, but that's not very descriptive. If you just write array, it means that, okay, this is a function that takes in an array value. And what this does is just, it finds the biggest number, and the code is exactly the same as the one we used in the previous example. The only difference is that this is kind of packed into a function. So what we do is find the biggest number, and at the start we assume it's the first number. So just let's just use this array as an example. and the index of this biggest number is also 1, because that's we can imagine that at this point we only checked at the first number, and of course if there's only one number, that number is the biggest number. And then we start looping through the array, and we start with the second number, and we check if the second number is bigger than our current biggest number, and our current biggest number is 5, so the first number. And in this case it is, so we save it as our next biggest number. So this biggest number becomes array of 2, so that's 7, and the index of this number becomes 2, so we know that our 7 is in the second position. So we go again through the array and we check if 12 is bigger than our current biggest number, and that's 7, and it is, so we say our biggest number is 12 and we index it as 3 because it's on the third spot. So up until this point we check the first 3 numbers and we continue with the fourth number, and the fourth number is 16, and of course that is bigger than our current biggest number 12, and we save it again, and 3 is not, so we just gonna ignore it. And the most important thing, or maybe the biggest difference up until this point, is the return on the return, because it contains 2 variables. So we return 2 values and not only just 1, and that is something that Lua can do, and it's actually very useful. Like in this case, it's only natural that we return both the biggest number and the index of the biggest number. Well, in some languages, maybe what you would have to do is create 2 functions or maybe find some workaround, but in Lua it's very simple that you can just return 2 variables. So if you wanted to use this function, what we could potentially do is write something like this. So we would say number, comma, index, so that is just our first variable, so this is where our first return value will be saved, and this is our second variable, and this is where our second variable will be saved, and we call the function find biggest number on our array. And then we just print out the result. So that's 16, 4. So 16 is our biggest value in our array, and 4 is the index of our biggest value. So in the fourth position is our biggest number. So that's very useful. And again, I want to emphasize that using functions means that we can create all other arrays with all numbered numbers that have, in this case, a variable length, so they can be longer or shorter. Let's just create a few quick ones just to kind of demonstrate. So in this case, we just have an array 1, and if you wanted to use this again without having to rewrite all this again, we would just say, okay, send in array 1, and we would get the biggest value of this array, so 12, 2. Of course, you know, maybe this function doesn't work as expected to, but you can always go back and fix it. And the greatest thing is, if you mistype, you only have to fix this function, and you don't have to fix both for loops when you create the function or the procedure for finding the biggest number in this array, and then of course another one, this one. It's just much compact and easier to navigate if you actually have a function like this. And not only that, it also improves on readability of the code a lot, because at this point you just look at the code and you're like, okay, find the biggest number of an array. So that's great because it's very it explains itself, you know, you find the biggest number in an array. And maybe if you want to look at the details, you would go into the function and you would see that it returns 2 values, so the number and the index, and that's what you could end up using. But you can see just how functions are especially useful, and they start becoming very useful when you're starting to write bigger and longer code. Okay, but the question here is, well, but is there a way to just, even though we return 2 values, is there a way to kind of pick which value we want back? And there are actually 2 ways to do that. So let's just say we don't want the number, but we just want the index for the sake of demonstration. What we would do is we would say index select. We would first put the number of which return value we want. So 1 is the first return value and 2 is the second return value. We want the second one because we want the index. And we would call this function again on any array we want. So we would just end this, and what ends up, of course, have to print it out. So if I just print it out, what ends up happening is we say, okay, give me the second one, so just give me the index of this return value, and we use the function on this index. And what ends up happening, of course, because the second number is the biggest, we get the number 2, which indicates the index. But it's kind of confusing, and even the way I explained it, it was a bit confusing, so there's a much simpler way, in my opinion, to do the same thing. So we don't need the select, even though it's technically valid and it's great. What you do is just put an underscore, which indicates that you expect a value to be returned, but you don't want to save it. And that was exactly what the underscore does. And you know, there's just nothing in the underscore and it's just gone. And if you put that there, the value of the biggest number is deleted and you don't save it, and the index does get saved. And this works the other way around, of course. So we just say number, and we wanted to do something like this and just print out the number. This would also work. But another benefit, because this is the first return value, we don't actually technically even need the comma and the underscore, but you can just leave it as an indication to yourself or someone else that this function actually does return 2 parameters. So this is it for the first part. If you liked it, if you have any questions, please ask them, because I would love to answer them. I know that these topics can get a bit hefty, especially now with the functions, and that we're kind of combining everything together. But with that said, the next video will have some more complex instructions and of course an example at the end to kind of reinforce what we learned throughout these videos. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you next time.